instead of asking people's opinion, coming from a system in which they're already locked in, you say, well, the only way to have an honest conversation is to first experience that system is actually a choice, and there are different choices. So that's I think what I hope that people take out of the paper, right? It's there are better ways of having a conversation, because we basically show that the current way of having the conversation is shooting ourselves in the foot.
Right.
I think another constructive approach as well, which I think has got a lot of promise, is to, again, reframe the conversation very slightly away from what we are doing now. Because the danger is it becomes, it's about driving, or it's about using my car or riding a bike. And ultimately, I think one of the things we've got an opportunity to do is reframe the conversation towards your goal.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Active Tense channel. My name is John Simmerman, and that is Professor Ian Walker and Professor Marco te Brömmelstroet. Ian is from the University of Swansea University there in Wales, and Marco is a professor at the University of Amsterdam. We're going to be talking about their recent paper on motonormativity. Let's get right to it with Ian and Marco. Professor Ian Walker, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast.
Oh, it's really great to be here. Thanks.
Ian, I love giving my guests just an opportunity to introduce themselves. Who the heck is Ian Walker?
I'm a professor of psychology at Swansea University in Wales. I've been working here for a couple of years, and I've been active in research related to cycling, pedestrians, motorcycling, and active mobility generally from a behavioural side, from a road user side, for well over 20 years now.
I love it. And before we hit record button, I was sharing with you that that's kind of my background is in behavior modification and looking at things from the psychology side. I started out as a scientist, doing research in exercise physiology and looking at the human body and how it responds to challenges like endurance challenges and whatnot. And then got into, disease containment and health promotion and things of that nature. So I love chatting with people who, have that background of the psychology side and the human behavior side, and that interaction between our built environment and perceptions and all of that. What was that origin story for you? What really got you interested in this field of study?
It was actually a really funny story. I was fresh out of postdoctoral research. And I'd been doing that work, and I did my PhD in a very different area. It was in memory and language. And I realized at that time I didn't want to spend the rest of my career doing that. And I had this period as I was settling into my first proper academic job of trying to think, well, what am I going to devote the rest of my career to? And one day, during this sort of 6-month period when I was wrestling with these questions, I was on my way to work on a bicycle. And a pickup truck pulled alongside, and someone leaned out and shouted abuse at me. And as he drove off, I thought, I could study this. And that literally just became, I had all these research skills. I knew the techniques of doing research because I was looking for the application. And that just made me think, well, this matters. This makes a difference. So let's do the work in this area.
I love that. That brings up this graphic that I found that might have been a graphic that was my good friends over at the War on Cars podcast may have used. It's like car plus brain and anger. It's like, what gives?
Yeah, I think they actually used that for the episode artwork on the episode I did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I first became aware of this concept, years and years ago with Tom Vanderbilt's book, Traffic. And he, sort of introduced this concept that we have this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde sort of approach when we get behind the wheel of an automobile. And psychologically, I think that there's something that happens because, when we're in control of a massively powerful, machine like an automobile, it's like something turns on, something switches in our brain. And of course, Tom wasn't the first to observe this. I mean, even this was something that Walt Disney was familiar with in the 1954 Motor Mania cartoon with Goofy, who turns into Mr. Walker and Mr. Wheeler. And I'm thinking that you probably know which. Yeah, it's classic. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating, how this turns on. And then, of course, there's a special level of energy, emotion, anger, just for cyclists, which is what you really ended up studying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, certainly in terms of that whole issue of why do people behave differently in the car, I think there's a lot of elements to that. And there are certainly people who know a lot of that better than I do. It looks like, from what I understand, there are elements of privacy and anonymity, which seem to be quite important in that. Sometimes I like to think this is a great way to understand how humanity behaves when they feel there are no repercussions to their actions. And it's a great way to see, it's a great way to get a very jaded view of humanity, if you think of it that way. But I suspect there's other things. There's clearly work being done on personal space and the idea that the car almost becomes an avatar, we could call it. That is this external projection of you and your identity. And we know that the cars people choose are absolutely a reflection of their identity, but so is the way that they drive the car. And there's this notion of, I can't remember the term now, but instrumental driving or something like this, where you drive in such a way as to say something about yourself. And so to challenge driving or to challenge the way people drive is probably going to hit people in lots of different ways, including their self-identity. One of the areas that I think is particularly important that really comes into some of the work we've been doing recently is also the norms about it. It is, it's kind of, you're meant to drive. Our societies tell us that this is the right thing to do. And I think that's also one of the reasons why people get so angry at times, because when they find it difficult to drive, which is very often the case, or when they are challenged about their driving, I suspect often people feel this is a challenge to the established order of the universe. And that is probably part of the reason why people get so emotive.
Yeah. And so, some of that earlier work that you had done, after that incident that really got you thinking, ooh, I need to look into this a little bit more. Talk a little bit about some of those fun early studies. You and I, before we hit the record button, we even mentioned, at least one of them that really popped into my mind. Talk a little bit about some of those early studies and some of the things that you think the audience will be, pretty intrigued to think, oh, this professor did this?
Well, there are kind of like two or three very early things. So the very first thing I did was to go out on a bicycle, get on a bicycle, get someone to take photographs of me at a junction, giving various cues, so looking over my shoulder, giving arm signals, things like this, and trying to look at what drivers were picking up on when they tried to judge a cyclist's intentions. And that was really interesting. And one of the things that popped out from that was it appeared that there was a change in drivers' reactions, which we could measure in their response times, when the camera was arranged in such a way that I was turning and looking into the camera. And as a psychologist, that got me thinking, oh, well, eye contact is known to be quite an important thing for human beings. And so I started looking further into that and did some interesting work where, again, showed people images of cyclists making maneuvers and had them judge what those maneuvers were doing, but then did it with eye trackers. So we could tell exactly where people were looking and when they fixated on things. And again, it was very clear there was this real homing of attention onto the cyclist's face, which maybe is not surprising, but it's potentially important. Because that then led to some other work early on, showing people scenes of traffic and asking them to describe what they see. And one of the things that was really interesting from that was this incredible division between human and non-human language, which I suspect is related to this social nature of vulnerable road users. If you walk, if you cycle, and to some extent, if you use a motorcycle, you are very clearly a human. And what we saw in that study was that the language people use is human language. Oh, a woman is crossing the road, a man is cycling along a path, it's this kind of thing, or a cyclist is doing such and such a thing. But as soon as there's a vehicle, the language changed and became inhuman language, even when you could see the driver. So, for example, one of the images we showed people had a woman crossing on a pedestrian crossing and a car there, and you could clearly see the driver in the car. And in almost every case, the language people would use spontaneously was something like, a woman is crossing the road while a car waits. And it became this non-human language. And of course, people like Laura Laker have really picked up on this and how that non-human language feeds into media reporting of collisions and takes away human agency and so on. So that was the very early stuff. And then probably the thing I then did, which I suspect some people might remember if they're old like me, is doing work looking at cyclists and how much space drivers leave when they overtake. And this was some work where I spent a fair bit of time cycling around with a distance sensor attached to the bike, wearing helmets or no helmets, wearing different clothes, and at one point disguising myself as a woman to see if women and men got treated differently. And that work got a lot of attention and quite a bit of controversy ever since.
Yeah, yeah. And I've got your website here pulled up, and there's all sorts of fun links to some of your past work. And so I'll make sure to include the link in the show notes below, here on this video. And then for those listening on listening only audience, we'll make sure that these links are in the show notes for you so you can dive into that. Spill the beans. What was the difference when you were wearing a wig versus other things in terms of passing distances?
Well, the wig makes a difference. So when I rode around with a long, dark wig on, because at the time I had quite dark hair 20 years ago, I got, on average, and obviously we're looking at averages across hundreds of drivers, but on average, drivers were leaving considerably more space when they passed, which is interesting because it suggests that it might in some ways be more dangerous to look like a man on the road. The other thing, in many ways, that finding sort of almost passed without comment. Interestingly, in Florida, they tested it with real men and women and found the same thing. And then some researchers in Australia tried it with men and women and found no difference. So there's obviously some important local cultural context as well going on. The other finding, of course, was that putting a helmet on seemed to lead to slightly closer passing. I think it was 8.5 centimeters on average. And that's been quite controversial. Some people don't like that, but it is what appeared to happen.
And if I remember correctly, I don't know if I remember the actual study or some of the conversations and that went on for years afterwards. It seemed to me that there was something along the lines too of whether the driver perception, because of how you were setting it up or others, had the person on the bike being more accomplished versus a beginner or even a child, somebody who's less stable on a bike. Am I remembering that correctly? The differences between those as well?
No, absolutely. That's really good memory. So at the end of that first study, I basically said, there's two likely explanations. And in the first piece of work, it wasn't possible to separate them. So one explanation was the kind of horrible one, which is at some level, maybe drivers are thinking, he's got a helmet on, he's safe if I hit him, and feel okay to take more risks around you if you look protected. And I was hoping that wasn't the answer. I was hoping the answer was the other one, which is that people take cycling equipment like helmets as an index of skill and experience.
Right.
And there were reasons to think that. So there'd been one study by Lynn Basford quite a long time earlier, which had kind of supported that idea. So then we did a second study. So I teamed up with a couple of colleagues from Brunel University, especially Ian Garrard, who said, look, I cycle like 30 miles every day. Why don't we just collect loads of data while I'm doing my daily commute? And so we tested this idea. We devised several different outfits for Ian to wear, some of which specifically were chosen to signal different levels of experience. So two of the outfits, well, one of the outfits was, very much what you'd expect, Lycra, Tour de France replica jersey, this kind of thing. And then I remember really distinctively, we sat round Ian's kitchen table one day saying, what can you wear that looks inexperienced? And we had this big discussion of what does an inexperienced cyclist actually look like? And in the end, we sort of went full on with it by getting a reflective vest made with novice cyclist written on the back. So we thought let's make sure that people definitely get the impression we want them to have. And we tested a few other outfits as well. But if you compare those two, which were the big critical comparison of the racing cyclist versus the novice cyclist, there was practically zero difference in how they were treated by passing drivers, which suggests that the effect I saw in that first piece of work probably wasn't down to perceived experience or skill. And it suggests that the horrible interpretation might be the right one, that at some level people see a helmet and just feel that there's protection going on and that therefore it's okay to drive a bit less safely.
And I've got your video here that you have of some of the endurance cycling stuff that you have done. And the term that we, of course, use, for those of us who have been out on the road, doing long distance cycling and even racing for that matter, we almost feel like it's almost like a punishing pass too, where you're like, oh, they see that we're like one of those guys, the guys that we kind of hate because they're, out on the road in their Lycra, and sometimes they're in huge groups, which make life inconvenient for us. But, we see the single individual out there, doing his thing, and the motorist comes as close as they quote unquote can without actually hurting us, but scaring us. Did you see any validation to that sort of dynamic that could be going? I know that's hard to delineate that out because you can't get inside the minds of the drivers, and it's hard to determine between just being oblivious versus, oh, I'm going to punish this person because I don't like them.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and there's a couple of things there. One, that point you just made at the end there about getting into the mind of the driver, that feels like the holy grail of that kind of research. How could you possibly do that in a way where you're going to actually get measurements of what people are really like? Because, of course, one of the strengths of the method we used was nobody knew they were being measured. So you were getting their true behavior. And I think there's every reason to believe that you wouldn't be getting their true behavior if they knew they were being measured. But you'd have to kind of do that if you want to know. And I don't know how to resolve that. So I don't actually have research data on something like punishment passes, but I have absolutely 100% experienced them as a cyclist. And I remember one time a few years ago, someone very clearly did it deliberately. And obviously I caught up with him at the next intersection. And I said, what was that? And he explained, you don't deserve to be here. You don't pay for the road. And that's why I did it.
Which brings up this cartoon. Because that's kind of what we're dealing with, is that, part of this motonormativity thought process, and we're going to dive deeper into what that actually means in just a moment here. But this is kind of the perception, is that, when we drive, there's this perception that, what we're doing is okay, but for those who are walking, running, or cycling, in the roadway ahead of us, that's wrong. That's, there's a disconnect there.
Yeah, and at some level, it's clearly seen as deviant by some people. And again, some other researchers have picked up some really interesting elements of this. So Rachel Aldred, for example, a researcher based in London, she years ago showed that to a lot of drivers, cycling is seen as a toy. And it's seen as almost an inappropriate thing to be doing, to be playing with your toy in the road, which is perceived as a place for serious people to do serious things. And actually, I saw that something similar years ago about this fundamental misunderstanding of why people are on bicycles. A very, very early piece of work I did was some work with bus drivers, because there'd been a lot of conflicts between bus drivers and cyclists in Oxford. And the county council asked me to come along and do some focus groups with the bus drivers. And one of the things that jumped out from those discussions was the bus drivers were sharing the road regularly with cyclists, because Oxford is one of the country's biggest cycling populations, with no clue in some cases about why people ride bikes. And there was a real perception among some of them that the only reason anybody rides a bike is to save money. And that then triggered this almost resentment of, you're putting yourself in danger, or you're putting that child in danger on the back of your bike just to save money. And that misunderstanding really led to some bad feeling in some respects.
Yeah. Save money, or worse, just make my life miserable. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating. So what we're striving to try to understand again is getting into the mind of the drivers, and there's also the problem, though, and you get into this in the research with motonormativity, is and of course, motonormativity is the formal name that you've coined. I believe you've created this name. Is this correct?
Yeah. So the term motonormativity was a paper I did with Alan Tapp and Adrian Davis, and we felt, not only was it quite fun to think of a scientific sounding name for something that people recognize, but we really felt that element of normativity was incredibly important, and we wanted to make that part of this idea that driving is not only common, but also seen as correct. And we felt that we really wanted to capture that.
Yeah. And we've got a cartoon on screen here, and I feel like this just screams that, because, this is, I'm assuming this is a politician or maybe a senior administrator within a city, and said, well, but people want more cars and people want more lanes. And yet the people who are like, in front of the podium are like, no, we want better options.
Well, I mean, I think one of the places we see this all the time, and I suspect any urbanist and almost certainly everybody watching this will be familiar with this, is the daily battle from business owners when there's talk of taking any parking away. And every single time this happens, and it's like a fight that has to be fought every single week over and over again. Anytime there's talk of taking parking away, people say, but how can people reach my business? People come here by car. And then again and again, organizations actually go and measure it, and they show that not only do far more people go to businesses without using a car than anybody realizes, but also they show that business owners systematically overestimate this. Exactly like this person is. And this has been done several times. There's been multiple research studies showing those two things. Loads of people get to businesses without using a car. People who own businesses overestimate car use. And it just keeps on happening over again. And that's almost a textbook example of this motonormativity phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah. So that reminds me too, that connection between cars and business access and access to parking brings up a conversation I had with the late, great Professor Donald Shoup, author of the fabulous book, The High Cost of Free Parking. And when I spoke with him in December, we just recently lost him in mid-January.
Yes. Yeah.
And when I spoke with him in December, we were talking about the fact that oftentimes those same businesses, like you're talking about. They're like resisting of giving up free parking out on, on the shopping streets, in front of their businesses. But then they're like, oh, but you mean, if we actually charge for parking, we can use that revenue to like really spruce up this block, which is exactly what happened in Pasadena, which is one of the great case studies. Then their perception completely changes, because then they're like, oh, it's not just a money grab. You're going to put this in the overall city coffers. You want to help my business and help that. Then we're okay. So it's funny how the paradigm can shift. We just have to crack that magic code to be able to get people to see things in a different way. That's paradigm shifts, and that's human behavior. That brings us right back to our sweet spot where we've been working on for many, many decades. Any wisdom, from the research that you've seen in terms of how, folks are able to shift some of the car brain motonormativity thought processes?
Well, let me try and answer that by throwing in an extra bit of car brain phenomenon. So again, when we did that very first study 2-3 years ago, my co-author Adrian Davis was really keen on this idea of pluralistic ignorance, the idea that one of the challenges might be that people support change but assume they're the only person who does so. Which, if you look at the world around us, would probably be quite a reasonable assumption, because the world is not full of urbanists waving placards demanding change. The world is kind of geared up to drive everywhere, and nobody ever seems to question it. And so it would be completely reasonable for a typical member of the public to look at that world and say, well, I don't really like crossing this road, but no one else seems to be complaining. Everyone else seems to be just getting on with things. And so Adrian really pushed that idea. And in the most recent piece of work, which Marco and I published just recently, we tested it and actually, there we go, and actually found that this was correct. So we asked people, how much do you support people's ability to travel by car? And then completely separately, we asked them, how much do you support people's ability to travel without using a car? And we asked those as two separate questions and subtract one from the other. And you get a nice score of how balanced are those two things for people. But we also asked them the same questions about what do you think your friends and family think? And then we asked them, what do you think an average person in your town thinks? And we saw this huge difference. So everyone we studied, not everyone I studied, but the majority of people we studied in the USA, the UK, and the Netherlands had quite a strong bias towards non-car travel. So they generally supported the ability to travel without a car more than they supported the ability to travel with a car. But as soon as you switch to what do you think other people think, they gave completely different responses. And it manifested in a few different ways. You could pick it up in just their average levels of support. The numbers for their own support completely different to what they thought other people said. But you also picked it up in other ways. So if you say, what's your level of support, and then you subtract from that what they think other people's are, you can see that it was sort of 66, 68, 69% of people across the countries felt that they were more supportive than average. And, it's impossible for 69% of people to be more something than the average, if you know what I mean. So we actually measured this tendency for people to assume that nobody else supports them. Now, interestingly, we picked up something very similar a few years earlier in a piece of work for a British organisation called Bike is Best. So this happened actually coincidentally just around about the start of the COVID pandemic. And there it was a representative national opinion poll done by a very reputable opinion polling company. And we did something quite similar. Again, how much do you support changes to streets to make cycling easier? And what do you think other people think? And again, you get these huge gradients of personal support is high, but this belief that other people don't agree with you. And so to a first approximation, you've got an entire nation of people and they're all looking at each other saying, well, I want change, but none of you do. And the next person's going, well, I want change, but none of you do. And it's almost like a circle of people not reading each other's minds. And so a big implication from this, and very clearly I've forgotten your original question at this point, but a big implication of this is we are doing consultation wrong. Because look what we do when we plan streetscape changes or when we plan to take a parking space away. What we do is local authorities or governments or cities go, hey, everyone, look, we're going to take this parking space away. Anybody got any thoughts on this? And that's how consultation is done. Now, that's going to be problematic if what we're claiming is correct. If it's true that everybody, most people feel alone in wanting change, you're not going to speak up. If 70% of people think the parking space should go, but they all believe that's unusual, they're not going to say anything. And therefore, the consultation will almost certainly become dominated by a few loud voices who are resisting the change. So the implication is of this pluralistic ignorance effect, we've got to do consultations better. We've got to be doing proper representative polling and asking a good cross-section of people what they think one at a time and learn what people think that way.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the Bike is Best campaign. And 3 years ago or so, maybe it was even more, they came up with this campaign and really, taking a stab at reframing, hey, what's the best tool to be able to do something, and the ridiculousness of this, and I think that this is kind of how we have to lean into just how silly it is that we think it's normal that to get a carton of milk or whatever, we get into a big SUV or a big, pickup truck. So
yeah. Well, I think one of the things this touches on is something that I think about an awful lot, which is, what's the perfect outcome from urban change? And although we sometimes joke about it, the perfect outcome is not ban cars. The perfect outcome is not there are no cars. That's not the outcome. The outcome is that people, and that's exactly what this advert was saying, people think about their journeys mindfully and select the mode of transport that is appropriate to the next trip from a menu of options in their heads. That's where we'd like to get to. But one of the things that happens, and I think that advert captures it nicely, is people paint themselves into a corner by choosing cars. The car a person chooses will often be an incredibly expensive investment. Very often they choose a large car, maybe a car that causes far more pollution and danger than necessary. And then you're in a position where every single trip you make, that commitment to creating the extra pollution and danger has to come into play because you've no options. And so this people cutting off their own decisions, cutting off their own options, right, is a big challenge, as well as the lack of awareness of the options that they have. So less investment in big, dangerous, polluting vehicles, but also more flexible, mindful choice of vehicle or mode on a trip-by-trip basis. That would be the holy grail.
Love it, love it. Okay, guess what? Look who came in. Boom. Marco, welcome. Welcome to the party. Why don't you do a real quick favor? Please introduce yourself to the audience.
My name is Marco de Brömmelstroet, and I'm a full professor at the University of Amsterdam in Urban Mobility Futures. And I'm also the chair of the Lab of Thought.
Fantastic, fantastic. And earlier, I know you from years ago when I was actively involved with some people for bike study tours to the Netherlands, and you addressed our group, one of the study tours that I was documenting as a videographer. You were very much involved with the Urban Cycling Institute too, one of the founders of that. Yeah, getting that together. Yeah. So good to see you again.
The Urban Cycling Institute is now completely run by Meredith Glazer, who you
Yes.
hopefully know as well.
I know her quite well. Yes.
Academic voice in the field, and I'm sort of following new paths to study mobility narratives, imaginaries in a bit broader sense than only the bicycle.
Yes, fantastic. And we're going to dive a little bit more into the paper, and I'll have you say a few words about the paper that you and Ian, Professor Walker, have been involved and engaged with. But before we do that, I would love to have you just say a word about your book that you did, and let's get you back in there. Boom, there you are. Talk a little bit about this book, and it's a fabulous book. I loved reading it a couple years ago when it first came out. Please introduce this book to the audience.
Well, that's putting me on the spot, but I think I can give it a try. The book starts with a conversation I had with a journalist, Thalia Fakade, and it basically covers the journey that we took together, a conceptual journey through the different layers of our mobility system. But it started, as so often the questions start, she came to me and asked me how the bicycle could be the solution to congestion. And instead of me providing a few professorial references and citations, I kept asking her questions like, why is this a problem? Why should the bicycle solve congestion? Why is this the key topic you want to write about? Aren't there more interesting elements of the mobility system and questions that are underlying that are relevant? And that's the first chapter. It's a bit of a spoiler, but it ended in sort of both of us very, very unhappy with that conversation. But it somehow, in both of us, we both ended up seeing each other as very interesting sparring partners to keep exploring those questions. And in the book, we take the reader through these different layers of thinking that actually are below the ways that we think about streets, the way that we think about mobility, and the way that we design our mobility systems. And I hope, I think the book does a good job, thanks to Thalia as a journalist. It also won the Best Journalist Book Award in the Netherlands. And I think that's definitely because of her writing. She really writes it from the perspective of a newcomer to the field, but she is also able to take the newcomer to these deeper layers and show the reader that if we really want a mobility transition, we need to challenge those underlying narratives. Because if we don't do that, we will never achieve the transition that we're all after. So the subtitle is How to Take Back Our Streets and Transform Our Lives. I would say that the necessary condition to do that is to question the choices that are underneath the current system. It's not a sufficient condition. We still have to do a lot of work then. But if we don't ask questions about those underlying imaginaries, assumptions, and worldviews, we will never achieve the systemic change that we're all after.
And the underlying assumptions and worldviews are very much a part of the paper that you and Professor Walker just did with, diving deeper into the concept of motonormativity. But before we jump into that, I want to linger a little bit more and sort of really pose the same question to you that I posed to Professor Walker, which is related to what really inspired you to do the work that you've been doing, to tackle these issues that you did in this book. And in this book, you shared a very personal story, even a tragedy, about the realities of our world, our car brain world. Go back, take us back. What's the basis of what was the inspiration for you doing this work that you've been doing across not just today, but across your career?
Well, that assumes that there was a plan behind it, right? So I've just been...
And it may not be a plan, yeah.
No, it's individually, I was always interested in mobility and land use planning and in the systems behind that. But I think due to the tragic event of seeing my friend being killed in a traffic crash at a very young age, I think it sort of made me aware that the system that we all take for granted should not be taken for granted, right? It's sort of being shocked to such an extent that that at the age of 9 already, I was really, I had the difficulty of understanding why other people were not asking questions about the system around us. So that sort of ties it together with motonormativity, right? But one addition to that is, I think, the motonormativity paper is really, as you say, it's car brain. But I would say that they're one level deeper, and that might be the follow-up paper that we can discuss here, is that also the car and car brain, according to me, are symptoms of the even deeper systems and assumptions that mobility should cater for individual fast mobility between A and B, that it's a disutility, it's something negative. I think cars and car brain and everything that we uncovered in the paper are not the problem, but are a symptom of the problem, or are a result of the problem. Right? It's very logical that we end up with the system that we have. If we realize that since the 1920s, we started to think about mobility in terms of individualized comfort or disutility for egoistic, isolated utility maximizers. So those assumptions that are completely solidified in our norms, design guidelines, policies, streets, and our imagination, I think are the real layers that I started to question already very early on in my life, and I think we need to question them if we really want to have a transition. And the work that I do and that I like a lot is, I think, once we do that, it suddenly opens up a much broader spectrum of possible solutions and much better conversations than that we are currently having. So it's also, in that sense, it's a blessing and a curse, right? You start seeing something, you can't unsee it. That the world around us is completely solidified version of an imaginary. But it's also a blessing, because I think as soon as you see it, you can start questioning it. You can start creating different conversations about different topics, and in such a way also find out that there's much more support for change than we generally think.
Yeah. And I think that's very important, is understanding these perceptions of how we're seeing the world. I remember a slide that you gave, and it might have been a presentation that you gave at recently at some honor that was bestowed upon you at some level, but it was the perception of a deer in a forest on a road, and what's the context of that? Take it from there, Marco. What was that?
Excellent choice from slides, because for me that's the pivotal slide that is so often misunderstood. So basically the point of the slide very early on in my presentation is to make people aware that we use language and narratives to simplify the world around us, and there's no way around that. We need to do that. That's sort of the human condition. And in that process, by definition, we make choices to look at things in a certain way. And those choices are arbitrary, but also crucial to understand, because they shape our world, right? But more often than not, we take them for granted. And I explain that through the use of metaphors, for instance, like time is money and all these things. But with the deer on the road, so you see the picture of a deer on a road. You could, but I'm already using language now, and I ask the audience, what do you see here? And then people start yelling, I see a deer on the road. And there's always a smart person in the room that says, no, I see a road through the forest. And then the next step is I want to then explain to the audience that neither of these two simplifications are per se more valid or better than the other. So they both have a similar validity, but choosing one over the other, which we have to do at the end of the day, makes us see some things while it obscures others. And this, I would say, for me at least, deeply philosophical point of that we always have to take a position is often misunderstood, and that people think there is a wrong and a right. There's a wrong and a right language. There's, for instance, if we bring it to our topic, cars are bad and bikes are good, or everything around motonormativity is wrong, and philonomy or thinking around bicycles is always right. that's for me not the point. For me, the point is that both of them are simplifications of reality, equally valid, but they lead us in completely different understandings of what problems are and in completely different understandings of what solutions are. And what I hope that I bring forward with my work is to make people lenient in that, and not an activist in saying your thinking is wrong, but more an artist who says your thinking is a choice, and you can choose to think and talk differently. And you can also choose to keep talking as you do, but then it's an active choice. It's no longer a matter of fact or something we take for granted. And well, that's all covered in that one slide, which is then often indeed, if you ask people afterwards, they think, oh, Marco, he told us that we shouldn't talk about the deer crossing the road, but it's the road crossing the forest. That's not the point. The point is that both are equally valid positions. But if you choose the one or the other, you have to be aware that that's a choice, and it's a very crucial choice because it will define everything from there on.
Yeah.
If I could just jump in there.
Please.
One of the things I think is really interesting as well, because I agree with everything Marco said there. I think that's a really nice framing. One of the things we touched on in this paper was then how that choice to see it's this way versus that way potentially over time becomes self-reinforcing through environmental changes. So a person sees the world this way, they therefore they lobby to have the world reflect their worldview. They lobby to have a built environment that supports their interpretation. They lobby to have a legal system that supports their interpretation. Then the next person comes along, and that's the environment they are exposed to, which further nudges them to reach the same interpretation. And this is almost certainly at the heart of this shared nature of these things. And it almost, now I say this out loud, it almost feels a bit like one of these thought experiments from chaos theory. Had the initial person gone the other direction in their interpretation of reality and started to shape a world, then maybe it would have cascaded in a completely different direction. But the self-reinforcing nature of this, I think, is one of the really interesting things.
Yeah, so the terms that we use is solidification, right? It starts out, like if you read Peter Norton's work in the 1920s, starts out with a very open and very wide discussion of how are we going to approach this? Because we are, at that point, we are inventing traffic engineering. It doesn't exist, so we need to find words and language. So in chaos theory, it's very crucial to understand who is the first person who writes the first syllabus for the first batch of students that will then become the first traffic engineers. And according to Norton, but maybe we can have a conversation, but that's how I interpret the book. It's a water engineer, and the water engineer starts to borrow from biology, and we start seeing traffic arteries that never can be clogged, and congestion becomes the biggest problem because we see the city as a body, and therefore we start building that system over time. So this is why I'm to this day I'm always the person in online conversations that points out this fact, because even people that see themselves as activists, there's a very beautiful paper last year by Hexwell et al. Who show that even people that think that they are innovative thinkers in this field are often also scope incumbent. They are still using the same logic, the same narratives, the same metaphors, and in that sense, they are much less effective in developing radical solutions than they think they are. And I would say that if you go to the book movement, we see that in the Netherlands, this really played out in the 1960s and 70s, when there was this really, really wide-ranging discussion where the bicycle represented not only a different mode of transport, but a different way of organizing society, mobility, and life, where John Lennon was in bed with a bicycle, not because he thought that it would solve congestion, but because it was representative of the end of capitalism, basically. And I would say that, and I'm now studying that with a number of students, I would say my strong hypothesis is that since then, we have lost that skill. We have lost the skill of really having radical conversations. So this solidification of this underlying narrative, also, of course, enforced by billions and billions of marketing budget, has solidified now what Ivan Illich called the last step of solidification is solidifying our imagination. which she called a radical monopoly, right? It's a thing that we are not even aware anymore of, that we are simplifying. So my neighbors here, they are not even aware that the street in front of their house is designed by somebody, right? They are not consciously aware that this was a political decision to offer this public space to park your vehicle. So that also makes conversations very hard. And I think the paper shows that motonormativity, I think, is a very good lever to show this, is that this is one of those taken for granted things, right? So we have become, especially in the Western world, and especially the people that have a privileged position in that world, they completely take for granted that all of that has been political choices. And one thing I want to add then, and then I'm also interested to hear what Ian thinks about that, but if we show this to people and tell it, that's for me not the end point, it's the starting point, because then you can say, going back to the chaos theory, everybody who makes a decision today can have a similar effect for the city in 60, 70 years. So now the choice is yours. Either you're going to reinforce the existing narrative and rebuild the same factory over and over again, you can do that. But in the Netherlands, I asked this to rooms of deputy mayors, and I asked them to all stand up, and I say, is that what you want? Then you can sit down. And they all keep standing up. They all say, no, we want a transition. Well, if you want a transition, you now have the obligation to really think better about the words that you use, because it will shape the system in the future. And I think that awareness, so that's my activist self. I think that's such an important tool or weapon almost to give to people, to shift the window or shift the opportunity space, make it bigger, to have much better conversations. And that's, again, I think the paper shows how we're stuck. But for me, that's the starting point of thinking, okay, but how then to get unstuck? We can't get unstuck if we keep talking with the same people in the same language.
There's a joke that I keep seeing on social media recently, and I don't know who started it, but it's something like, people always talk about going back in time and making this tiniest change, and the entire future becomes different. And they're terrified of that, but they won't make a tiny change in the present and see that as a way of changing the future. And I think that is one of those things we need people to realize. Something else that I think comes out really nicely from what Marco was saying there, and I think one of the things that I quite like about the work we did on the motonormativity, is it doesn't require the idea that this is deliberate or malicious. It's more a statement of, this is just how things are. There's definitely a version where some people do this kind of thing in bad faith. And I think that notion of what Marco just talked about language can be part of this. One of the places you see this a lot is the quite, sometimes inadvertent, but very often deliberate use of terms like progress as a way of capturing the narrative around the importance of motoring. And actually what people tend to be doing is pushing forward this very 1950s view of the world when they say, oh, the car is the future, the car is progress. You want to drag us back into the past with your bicycles. So you do get this kind of bad faith version of it sometimes. And you will see this kind of language from car industry at times. But fundamentally, what I think we showed is that this happens in a much more inadvertent way. Most people are not setting out to fight change. They are just the product of their environment, which causes them to see the world in such a certain way that the notion of change feels threatening because they've only really known one reality.
And I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that I've been trying to do here on the channel is emphasize that we shouldn't be taking this work, these studies, these results, and then using them as a tool or a weapon, as you just said, Marco, to bludgeon people over the head, because again, because of the whole nature of the framing that has been done and the, if you want to call it, brainwashing that has been done over the period of, nearly 80 to 100 years, as Peter Norton has done such a good job of documenting as a historian. we have to have a certain sense of empathy, because we're not going to get anywhere if we just spend our time shouting at each other and saying you're the one to blame. And I mean, as researchers, any thoughts that you might have or guidance for the audience to try to use this for a way to have better enhanced awareness and empathy towards the conditions that we all find ourselves in?
Well, if I can start, so I'm an urban planner, right? So I'm educating people in not only understanding the world but also changing it. And so although the study itself shouldn't be used as a weapon, I think it does give us, well, indeed, first of all, empathy. So it's a condition we're all in, and it's a system that you cannot just escape. You cannot like you can question capitalism, but try living without it. It's almost an impossibility. But I think we also end the paper with that. I think there are a few important guidelines that at least we can say that if we. So one example in the Netherlands, we have a lot of cities that are currently finally in the process of taking back the notion that you can park your private vehicle for free in public space, which is a relatively recent phenomenon, but there's a lot of resistance against it. And what then happens in those cities is that this is proposed, and then political opponents force a referendum on it. And then the referendum asks the question, do you want to pay for parking or do you want it for free? Well, if you ask that question to a Dutch person, what do you think the person says, right? So do you want your beer for free or do you want to pay for it? So one thing that we propose with this paper is that if you want to have a more honest conversation with citizens, you should ask your question differently. So you should ask not only do you want to pay for something or do you want it free, but you should ask what are your values on a range of topics that all require space on our streets, and which of them need to go for the others. And we have done those studies in different cities, and then you see indeed that the conversation also starts including people that would normally be excluded from the conversation, because in most Dutch cities still, we are lucky, but I think also in the UK this applies, most citizens do not own a car. And they don't see themselves represented in these kinds of referenda, because they're like, why should I have anything to say about paying or not for parking? But if you say, well, it's also about, do you think that the physical, mental and social health of our children is an important part of what we do in public space, then many more people are joining the conversation. And I think that's also a matter of empathy. We need to speak, we need to listen to citizens, sure, but we also need to then ask questions that actually bring in all citizens. So that's one. The second thing that's related to that is that in this condition that we all take for granted, you can have two approaches to change. So we talked about this in the paper, and I think the term that fits for me best is this hill of hysteria. This idea of lots of resistance against change from a small minority, right? This pluralistic ignorance element. So you can do a few things. You can be an enlightened despot and just bombard over it. I would say that's a bit what's currently happening in Paris. So we have a mandate, and we are going to change the city. And then in the next elections, you can tell us if you like it or not. But you can also lower this hill of hysteria by saying, let's try it out. Let's figure out ways of experiencing a world where, for instance, children can go to school by themselves for one day in every month, and then have a conversation. So instead of asking people's opinion coming from a system in which they're already locked in, you say, well, the only way to have an honest conversation is to first experience that system is actually a choice, and there are different choices. So that's I think what I hope that people take out of the paper, right? It's there are better ways of having a conversation, because we basically show that the current way of having the conversation is shooting ourselves in the foot.
Right.
I think another constructive approach as well, which I think has got a lot of promise, is to, again, reframe the conversation very slightly away from what we are doing now. Because the danger is it becomes, it's about driving, or it's about using my car or riding a bike. And ultimately, I think one of the things we've got an opportunity to do is reframe the conversation towards your goal. What are you trying to accomplish today? In almost all cases, nobody sets out to sit in a metal box, piloting a metal box around a town. There are some people like genuinely are into cars, and driving the car is the goal. But usually driving the car is not the goal. Usually the goal is getting to the shops or taking children to school or accessing work or whatever it is. And wouldn't it be amazing if we got the conversation started at that point, rather than start it 2 steps down the decision process from there? Because that tends to be what happens. People are starting not with what am I trying to accomplish. They're starting with, well, 26 years ago, I decided that I always accomplish my travel goals by using a car. And now we start the conversation there. And again, reshifting the conversation onto what are people trying to accomplish on a day-by-day basis or trip-by-trip basis has the potential to tackle this in a way that takes away the sting. Nobody's shouting at you about your choices. It's just asking you in a quite an honest way, what are you trying to accomplish today? And I think that sort of individual trip approach might complement quite nicely the higher level stuff that Marco's talking about as well.
Yeah. Well, speaking of shouting, I want to pull this up and then go ahead, Marco.
No, I think this is an interesting conversation that for me, I interpret still as scope incumbent, right? So if we have that conversation, which I agree is a much better way of having a conversation, it is still about shifting people from one mode to another mode, and that there's good reasons, and sometimes that is the goal. But I would say that it still limits us in thinking about streets as pipelines of a water engineer where people go from A to B. And I think we can even have an even better conversation if we open up that the goals are not only how do you get about your individual daily routine, but also what do you need from public space? And that's often, for instance, in the Netherlands, again, we have 18 million people in our country, and 2 million of them experience severe loneliness. So why are we not bringing that into the conversation? Because that's also part of how we are underway and how we use our streets.
Yeah, that's a really good. Sorry.
Yeah, so I follow Ian, but I would, and I think sometimes that's something that we need to contextualize. Sometimes the conversation is as Ian suggests, and sometimes I think there's room to have this bigger conversation. And I would say one place to have that conversation should be in political programs. So I really hope that in the coming years we see political programs where the mobility paragraph is no longer this technical, slightly different version of the same text, but it's radically different, connected to radically different values, showing that there are radical dilemmas that need to be solved in public space that are not only traffic. Actually, traffic, I think, is mostly in the way, because I like that you show this picture. I see this picture, and then Dutch Cyclists Union sees this picture and say, yeah, let's make this red asphalt and make it into a bicycle street to cater for everybody. But what I also see is that there are no trees in the street. There's no shadow. There are no children playing, and it will not be solved with making the asphalt red, right? So I think that, but that's maybe a privileged position in the Netherlands, that time is ripe to have the conversation and to shift it back again to the era before traffic engineering, when streets were remaining spaces between buildings. There were no deputy mayors, there were no ministries. It was just a space where many different goals needed to be served. And we did that for millennia without asking traffic engineers to solve it for us.
I think that's a really fair challenge. It's a really good challenge. And I think we could go even further in that direction. So a couple of times I've been asked by politicians, what would you like me to say? Which is actually a very good politician's question. What outcome would you like here? And quite often, whenever I've been given that challenge, I've said, well, what I'd love is a politician who stands up and their vision is, let's make a city where everybody has an amazing life without having to buy a car. Reframing it towards that even higher level goal of, let's just have amazing, connected, happy, healthy lives. And then all this other stuff falls out from that if you agree that that's what we're trying to get to.
Right.
I would argue that, but from a distance, that's sort of what Anne Hidalgo presented as a re-election platform, right? It's not. It wasn't a mobility platform. It was really about repairing the city, basically repairing the tissue of the city, because it was ripped apart, and many people recognize that. And that's also always funny if you bring that up. There's always people shouting, "Well, the majority is against her," and I'm like, "Well, democratically, no, because she was re-elected." So it seems, again, it comes back to the paper, right? In a motonormative frame, it has to be in many people's minds that everybody, no, at least a large majority, should be against this, because the world works so fine and happy for us as it currently is, and they are underestimating the extent to which it doesn't work for so many people that they are not talking to, that they are not represented, that don't come to evenings about traffic regulations, traffic lights, timings, or parking policies. So again, I think one thing that I would advise planners is you need to be empathic. You need to be more inclusive. So you need to step away from the language that has excluded so many people from the conversation. And I agree, it wasn't malicious. Although there are also, we are currently close to publishing a paper on devious frames, where there is some evil also in. There are, of course, people that empower, that aim to keep the current regime in place as long as possible. So there's also that. But to a large extent, it is people that are completely unaware of this. They just think, and that's one of the things that I really like. This short anecdote is that there was a Dutch newspaper that published about our paper, and then the journalist put on LinkedIn a message saying, "I wrote this article about this," and then also included a poll. And in the poll, he basically asked his audience, "Do you support measures for less cars in our cities?" And as completely expected, 85% of the thousands of people that were responding supported that. But in the comment section, it was only people shouting against it. And what always surprises me is that these people are very, very good in using a grammar that makes it look like they are telling truisms, right? For instance, the one that always comes up is, "Everybody loves their car." That's what people tell. Everybody loves their car. You can say that without any evidence, and people are like, "Yeah," but most people do not. Most people don't own a car. Some people that own a car don't love it, and I always bring in. I think most people love their kids as well. I hope, and many people love their dog. So we need to bring that into the debate as well.
But you can see how it happens, because go and look at the world around you. I'm looking at the world outside my office window here. It is compatible with the hypothesis that everybody loves their cars.
Yeah. And we saw this cartoon earlier, and this is a derivation of that same thing, is that, yeah, of course people want more cars. Everybody loves their cars. Yeah. We do need to bring this to a close. So in order to do that, I'd love each of you to kind of share what's next. What's the next step? You know, you may have hinted at it a little bit, Marco, there of where the research might go moving forward. Ian, I'll have you start off, and then Marco close us out.
I've got a few things in progress. One thing I'm quite keen to do is find better ways to measure motonormativity. And I think that's a research goal that could be done usefully. But actually, probably the really exciting thing is some work from a PhD student of mine, Catherine Norty, who I had a meeting with just yesterday. And she's got some really exciting new stuff coming out that is pertinent to this. It's slightly separate, but pertinent. That's emerged from some work she's been doing on. It started out as questioning the notion of a vulnerable road user. So her PhD essentially said, I want to pick that apart and see if there's anything real about it, or whether it's just a construct that's causing problems. She's done some astonishingly good work getting to grips with that, looking at how lay people and experts in inverted commas, use the notion of vulnerability on the road, how it's entrenching problems and entrenching power relations. But then what she just found with some data she showed me yesterday is this is also leading to all sorts of really astonishingly profound victim blaming and a marginalization of groups based on what arguably is emerging from a sort of motonormative mindset, but it's feeding into this very specific issue of how marginalized groups are being viewed and treated. And so I'm quite keen to explore that a bit further as well.
Lovely. Marco.
I'm so much looking forward to that study. And a few things. I really enjoyed that this study came about as a crowdfunding project. So it was a very quick turnover. It started, as I hope Ian remembered, with me looking at the YouTube video where he made the hypothesis that in the Netherlands, surely motonormativity would be lower. And I think I explicitly challenged you for a bottle of wine because I thought it wasn't. So I owe you a bottle of wine. Although I still
We've got this on record.
But I still want to put another bottle of wine next to that one because, as we are indeed already hinted to, I think that we should try to make this study one step deeper and having sort of the traffic engineering normativity, sort of this idea that streets are throughput spaces and so on. I think that is very strong in the Netherlands, and I would really love that. And similarly to the vulnerable road user, I think also there the underlying narrative of road safety is the problem. The idea that we are saving people's lives instead of taking away the danger, and through that deliberate construct, we are normalizing the danger, and the danger becomes worse and worse every year. The systemic violence in the system becomes worse. And the disciplining of people becomes even stronger. Now, also the Netherlands this year will see the first big ministerial campaign to push helmets on cyclists. So also there, I like to go deeper. But what really fascinates me is working with all kinds of projects that aim to provoke and radically shift the conversations, what we call finding new narrative seeds, and try to see how we can empower new stories. So one is around the autonomy of children, for instance, and the idea is that if you develop that story, you are creating a political reality where it's very hard to argue against with the original motonormative set of the guidelines, right? It's politically, also in the Netherlands, it's politically very acceptable position to hate cyclists. It's a very hard political position to hate children, I found out. So it is interesting to see. So can we somehow? So we develop all kinds of projects, artwork, provocations, academic studies, where we try to figure out different pathways that can then challenge motonormativity. And of course, if we apply those kinds of interventions, then so we have now a zebra crossing printer developed, where everybody who wants to can now print their own zebra crossing. It's a €200 machine that you can build yourself. But then, of course, the notion is that this makes people aware of something. And then, of course, ideally, you should have a before, during, and after measurement of does this indeed make people aware of their motonormativity. So I see a very connected steps forward of planning, doing interventions, street experiments, connected to the more fundamental research on can we find evidence that there is a cure for motonormativity?
Yeah. I look forward to bringing you both back on after, these additional research papers come out, and this has been such an honor and pleasure having you both on. Ian and Marco, thank you so much for joining me on the Active Towns podcast.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be on the show and to talk with you about this.
Hey, thank you all so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And if you did, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment down below, and share it with a friend. And if you haven't done so already, be honored to have you subscribe to the channel. Just click on the subscription button down below and ring that notifications bell. And if you are enjoying this content here on the Active Towns channel, please consider supporting my efforts by becoming an Active Towns ambassador. Super easy to do. Just navigate over to activetowns.org, click on the support tab at the top of the page. There's several different options, including becoming a Patreon supporter. Patrons do get early and ad-free access to all my video content. Okay, that's it for now. Until next time, this is John signing off by wishing you much activity, health, and happiness. Cheers. And a huge shout out to all my Active Towns ambassadors supporting the channel via YouTube Super Thanks, Buy Me a Coffee, Patreon, as well as making contributions to the nonprofit. I could not do this without you. Thank you all so very much.